Charles Edward ended his life in a derelict stable, his face so ravaged by cancer that one eye had to be carved out. This horrific physical decay was the final receipt for a marriage that sold its soul to the devil. The architect of this ruin was his wife, Victoria Adelaide. Driven by a ruthless hunger for power, she pushed her husband into the arms of the Nazis, transforming a British royal into a general for Hitler. His gruesome end was the ultimate price for the ambition that dragged a prince into the wreckage of the Third Reich. Before the monster, there was the boy, a fragile English prince growing up in the lush safety of Surrey, never meant for the blood-soaked chessboard of Europe. Charles Edward was born Prince Charlie, the posthumous son of Prince Leopold, the youngest and most intellectual of Queen Victoria's sons. Leopold had been a hemophiliac, living his life on the edge of a blade, and Charlie inherited a certain fragility of spirit from this lineage. He grew up in the lush green safety of Claremont House in Surrey. He was an English boy, through and through, a quiet youth who loved the English weather, the English language, and the predictability of the British court. He was never meant for the great game of European politics. However, the grandmother of Europe viewed her grandchildren as chess pieces. When the reigning Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha died without a direct heir, the succession fell to the British line. After others declined the honor of moving to Germany, the 16-year-old Charlie was told by his grandmother that he was to be the next Duke. This was an imperial decree, a command that shattered his English life. In 1900, the boy who struggled with German and cherished his life as a minor British royal was uprooted and sent to a country that felt alien, cold, and demanding. He was a bewildered teenager, expected to rule a duchy he didn't care for, in a language he barely understood. This initial displacement is crucial. It created a permanent state of otherness in Charles Edward. In England, he was now a German, and in Germany, he was always the Englishman. This fractured identity made him desperately hungry for a sense of belonging. He spent his early years in Germany trying to be more German than the Germans, a common trait in displaced royals. He joined the military, he practiced his guttural R's, and he donned the stiff Prussian uniforms. But beneath the medals, he remained a timid, indecisive man, looking for a pillar to lean on. On the surface, his union with Princess Victoria Adelaide of Schleswig-Holstein in 1905 seemed like a standard royal match. She was the niece of Kaiser Wilhelm II, a connection that was supposed to solidify Charlie's place in the German Empire. But Victoria Adelaide was not a standard royal bride. She was a woman of fierce, unyielding convictions and a burning nationalistic pride. While Charlie was soft and adaptable, she was hard and ideologically rigid. She didn't want a husband who was a quiet duke. She wanted a husband who was a titan of German power. The early years of their marriage were a slow-burn exercise in personality molding. Victoria Adelaide quickly realized that her husband was a man who could be easily led if the right person held the leash. She became his primary advisor, his translator of German culture, and eventually his political compass. She didn't just share his life, she began to inhabit his mind. When World War I broke out in 1914, the fragile bridge Charles Edward had built between his English heart and his German duty collapsed in spectacular fashion. The Great War was Charlie's undoing. He was a British prince holding a German command, watching his cousins in the British Royal Air Force drop bombs on his subjects, while he was forced to command troops against his own kin. The trauma of this conflict cannot be overstated. By the end of the war in 1918, he had lost everything. The German monarchy was abolished. His titles were stripped by the British Parliament under the Titles Deprivation Act, and he was left as a commoner in a broken, starving Germany. This was a soul-rot bred in the oppressive silence of the ducal estate, not the halls of Parliament. As the maps of Europe were redrawn by blood and iron, the internal map of Charles Edward's soul was being redrawn by the woman he had sworn to cherish. The loss of his British titles wasn't just a political setback, it was the removal of his primary armor. In this state of psychological exposure, he became the perfect raw material for Victoria Adelaide. She saw a man who had been discarded by the House of Windsor, and she moved with clinical precision to ensure that his only remaining loyalty would be to her and the dark rising tide of German nationalism she worshipped. This was the moment the architect of the devil was truly born. The loss of his British identity felt like a betrayal by his own family. He felt discarded by the House of Windsor. In his eyes, he was a victim of a world gone mad. But while Charlie drifted in a sea of self-pity and confusion, Victoria Adelaide saw an opportunity. She did not accept their fall from grace. To her, the loss of their ducal power was a personal insult that required a vengeful response. She began to feed his resentment, transforming his sadness into a cold, hard bitterness. She began to whisper in the dark of their bedroom, a place where no advisors could intervene. She told him that the old world had failed them. She spoke of the stab in the back, the myth that Germany had been defeated not on the battlefield but by traitors at home, specifically Jewish conspirators and socialists. These weren't just political theories to them, they were the explanations for why they no longer lived in a palace with 1,000 servants. Victoria Adelaide radicalized her husband by tying their personal loss to a national tragedy. She convinced him that the only way to reclaim his dignity was to join the most radical elements of the rising New Germany. By the mid-1920s, their home was a hub for extremists. While other royals tried to distance themselves from the brawling street politics of the era, Victoria Adelaide pushed Charlie toward the fringes. She saw in the fledgling Nazi Party a mirror of her own rage. When Adolf Hitler was still just a fringe agitator, she recognized his potential as a wrecking ball that could smash the system that had humiliated her husband. She didn't just support Hitler, she groomed her husband to be Hitler's royal trophy. Charlie, the timid British prince, was slowly being replaced by a man who wore the brown shirt of the SA. Victoria Adelaide's manipulation was masterful. She played on his need for a father figure, which Hitler provided, and his need for a clear identity, which the Nazi ideology offered. She transformed his English politeness into German obedience. By the time the decade neared its end, the man who once had a Surrey accent was now practicing the Nazi salute in front of his bedroom mirror, encouraged by the nodding approval of his wife. This was a marriage of complicity. Every time Charles Edward hesitated at the brutality of the movement, Victoria Adelaide was there to remind him of his duty to Germany and the betrayal of his English cousins. She turned their domestic life into a radicalization cell. This wasn't a case of a husband leading a wife. It was a woman using her husband as a vessel for her own political fanaticism. She wanted the power Hitler promised, and she was more than willing to sacrifice her husband's soul to get it. But whispers in a bedroom are merely echoes until they are given a voice in the halls of power. As the 1920s roared with chaos, the conspiracy of two moved from private resentment to public action. Victoria Adelaide knew that for her husband to truly reclaim the glory she craved, he had to do more than just listen to her theories. He had to fund the monster that would implement them. The transition from a husband being pumped with hate to a royal patron of the Nazi Party was the moment Charles Edward crossed the Rubicon. He was no longer just a victim of circumstance. He was becoming the architect of his own damnation, stepping out of the shadows of his wife's influence and into the harsh flickering light of the Nazi rallies. The transition from a displaced aristocrat to a dedicated foot soldier of the Third Reich was not an overnight leap. It was a slow, agonizing crawl through the mud of resentment, guided every inch of the way by Victoria Adelaide. To understand the depth of her influence, we must look at the climate of the Saxe-Coburg household during the 1920s. While the Weimar Republic struggled with hyperinflation and social chaos, the former Duke and Duchess lived in a state of frozen fury. Their palace, the Vesta Coburg, was no longer the seat of a sovereign, but a monument to what they felt had been stolen. Victoria Adelaide realized early on that Charles Edward's greatest weakness was his British politeness, a lingering residue of his English upbringing that made him recoil from the vulgarity of street brawls and the harsh rhetoric of the far right. She knew that to make him a true believer, she had to break his connection to the gentlemanly codes of his youth. This was the bedroom radicalization in its most clinical form. In the privacy of their quarters, she would dissect his day, criticizing his hesitations and reframing his British-born empathy as a dangerous liability. She argued that the world that produced him had died in the trenches, and only the hard men of the new movement could offer him protection. She began to introduce him to the intellectual architects of racial purity and German mysticism. She didn't just give him Nazi pamphlets, she curated an environment where the most extreme voices were the only ones he heard. She invited figures like the racial theorist Hans F. K. Gunther to their home, ensuring that Charles Edward was surrounded by a pseudo-scientific justification for the hatred she was fostering. She convinced him that his blood, his royal ancient blood, was being diluted by the democratic and Jewish influences of the modern world. By linking his aristocratic identity to racial survival, she made his radicalization feel like a noble quest rather than a moral descent. By 1922, the conspiracy of two reached a critical turning point. Charles Edward met Adolf Hitler for the first time. At this stage, Hitler was still a regional agitator in Bavaria, viewed by many aristocrats as a bohemian corporal who was useful but uncouth. But Victoria Adelaide saw something else. She saw a man who spoke the language of the resentful. She pushed Charles Edward to not only meet Hitler, but to fund him. This was a massive gamble. For a member of the European royalty to bankroll a revolutionary was a scandal of the highest order. But under his wife's direction, Charles Edward became one of Hitler's first high society patrons. The dynamic between the three of them was fascinating and grotesque. Hitler, who was deeply insecure about his own lack of social standing, was enamored with Charles Edward's royal pedigree. To Hitler, Charlie was a living bridge to the old world he sought to conquer. To Victoria Adelaide, Hitler was the hammer she would use to smash the Republic. And Charles Edward? He was the anvil, caught between them, being reshaped with every strike. He found in Hitler a strange masculine energy that he lacked. Hitler gave him orders, and for a man who had spent his life being told what to do, first by his grandmother, then by the Kaiser, and now by his wife, the clarity of Nazi commands felt like a relief. The manipulation in the bedroom during this period took on a more strategic edge. Victoria Adelaide began to use their social calendar as a weapon. She would purposefully exclude any friends or relatives who expressed skepticism about the Nazi movement. She isolated Charles Edward until his only social circle consisted of the party faithful. She turned their marriage into a fortress, where the only currency was loyalty to the Führer. She convinced him that the British royal family, his own cousins, now the House of Windsor, had not just stripped his titles, but had actively tried to destroy him. She painted King George V as a traitor to the Germanic race. This was the masterstroke of her radicalization. She turned his home into the only place where he felt truly understood. By alienating him from his British roots and his moderate German peers, she made herself his only source of truth. He became pathologically dependent on her approval. If he showed any sign of doubt, she would weaponize his shame, questioning his courage and his Germanness. For a man who had spent his life trying to prove he wasn't just an English intruder, this was the ultimate psychological pressure point. As the swastika rose over Berlin, the royal ambassador became a mask for a much more sinister reality. It is a terrifying paradox that the more prestigious Charles Edward's uniform became, the more his humanity began to erode. Under the constant, unyielding pressure of Victoria Adelaide's ambition, his role shifted from mere diplomacy to the management of death. The transition into his leadership of the German Red Cross marks the point where the radicalization was complete. He was no longer a man who had been tricked. He was a man who had been rebuilt. As president of the German Red Cross, Charles Edward didn't hold the scalpel. He held the clipboard, providing a royal veneer for the systematic slaughter of the unfit. In 1933, when Hitler finally seized power, the architect of the devil was ready to step into the light. Because of his early support, Hitler rewarded Charles Edward with positions that were both symbolic and functional. He wasn't just a figurehead. He was made the president of the German Red Cross. This is perhaps one of the most chilling chapters of his life. Under his leadership, and with Victoria Adelaide's constant oversight, the German Red Cross was coordinated into the Nazi state apparatus. This meant that an organization dedicated to humanity was now being used to facilitate the T4 euthanasia program, the systematic murder of the disabled, and those deemed unworthy of life. Charles Edward signed the decrees. He oversaw the transition of the Red Cross into a tool for racial cleansing. While he may have told himself he was merely organizing, the reality was that he was providing a veneer of royal respectability to mass murder. And through it all, Victoria Adelaide was his cheerleader. She viewed these actions as necessary cleansing for the restoration of the German spirit. She hosted parties for SS officers and high-ranking officials, using her royal charm to smooth over the jagged edges of Nazi brutality. She was the one who made the banality of evil feel like a high society event. As the 1930s progressed, Charles Edward's uniform became more elaborate, and his speeches became more vitriolic. He traveled to London for the funeral of King George V in 1936, wearing his Nazi uniform, a deliberate provocation intended to show his former family that he was no longer one of them. He was now a creature of the Third Reich. He even attempted to act as a secret intermediary between Hitler and the new king, Edward VIII, hoping to forge a pro-Nazi alliance that would unite his two worlds. He was no longer a timid prince. He was an arrogant emissary of the devil, fueled by the conviction that his wife's vision for the world was finally coming to fruition. But even as he stood at the height of his power, a dark shadow was beginning to form. The conspiracy of two was based on a lie, the lie that one could sell their soul for power and not eventually be consumed by the fire. Victoria Adelaide had pushed him to the edge of the abyss, and as the drums of World War II began to beat, the price of their complicity was about to become physical. The first signs of the karma that would eat his face were years away, but the moral rot was already complete. He was a man who had traded his British honor for a Nazi whip, and as the world prepared for the greatest slaughter in human history, Charles Edward was positioned as one of its primary overseers. By the late 1930s, the transformation of Charles Edward was no longer a matter of private manipulation. It was a public spectacle of betrayal. Under the watchful, unwavering gaze of Victoria Adelaide, the man once known as the Duke of Albany had become Hitler's most effective royal ambassador. While the SS and the Gestapo handled the dirty work of terror, Charles Edward was tasked with something perhaps more insidious, making the Third Reich look respectable to the outside world. Victoria Adelaide understood that her husband's British lineage was his most valuable asset to the Führer. She coached him on how to play the English gentleman, while secretly promoting Nazi interests. This was the era of his frequent trips to Britain, where he functioned as a bridge for the Anglo-German fellowship. In these circles, he wasn't viewed as a monster, but as a misunderstood cousin trying to prevent another war. Behind the scenes, however, he was reporting directly to Hitler on the British political climate. He was, in essence, a spy in a Savile Row suit, radicalized so thoroughly that he viewed his own birthplace as a target for liberation by the German spirit. When World War II finally erupted in 1939, any lingering remnants of the timid prince vanished. The conspiracy of two became a wartime pact. As the German Wehrmacht swept across Europe, Charles Edward didn't hide in a bunker. He leaned into his role as a general in the NSKK and the SA. He was a man possessed by the momentum his wife had built for him. Victoria Adelaide took on the role of the Iron Duchess, organizing relief efforts that were strictly reserved for Aryans and ensuring that their household remained a bastion of Nazi orthodoxy, even as the first rations began to affect the German people. The psychological toll of the war on their marriage was profound. As the casualty list grew, Charles Edward began to see the true face of the ideology he had embraced. He saw the devastation of the Blitz on the London streets he once walked as a boy. But whenever a flicker of doubt crossed his mind, Victoria Adelaide was there to extinguish it. She reframed the destruction as a necessary cleansing. She convinced him that the British were the aggressors, that his family in Windsor had forced Hitler's hand. This was the intimate gaslighting that kept him anchored to the regime. She didn't allow him the luxury of a conscience. To her, a conscience was a British weakness they could no longer afford. As the president of the German Red Cross during the war years, Charles Edward's complicity deepened into the realm of the demonic. He was the one who provided the legal and humanitarian cover for the transport of prisoners and the medical experiments occurring in the camps. While he may not have held the scalpel, he held the clipboard. He visited concentration camps like Buchenwald, wearing his crisp uniform, walking past the emaciated and the dying with a stoic, detached expression that Victoria Adelaide had taught him to maintain. She believed that greatness required the ability to look at suffering and see only the greater good. War brought a dark, frenetic energy to their lives. As the tide began to turn after Stalingrad, and the Allied bombers began to turn German cities into infernos, the couple's radicalization reached a fever pitch. In the face of certain doom, Victoria Adelaide didn't suggest surrender or escape. Instead, she pushed for a Nero decree mentality, total commitment to the end. She began to speak of a Wagnerian Götterdämmerung, a twilight of the gods, where they would either rule the world or burn with it. It was during these high-stress years that the physical toll began to manifest, though silently at first. The stress of maintaining a lie of such magnitude, the constant pressure of his wife's expectations, and the weight of the atrocities he had authorized began to erode Charles Edward's health. He began to complain of skin irritations, small lesions that wouldn't heal, the first whispers of the cancer that would later claim his face. At the time, they were dismissed as the results of a high-protein wartime diet or simple nervous exhaustion. In reality, they were the first cracks in the vessel of his body. The most tragic aspect of this period was his total isolation. By 1944, Charles Edward was a man without a country and without a family. His British relatives had formally disowned him. He was the traitor prince. His German subjects viewed him as a relic of an old order that had led them to ruin. His only tether to reality was Victoria Adelaide. This made her grip on him absolute. He couldn't turn back because there was nothing to turn back to. He was a man standing on a narrowing ledge, with his wife standing behind him, preventing him from stepping away from the edge. As the Red Army closed in from the east and the Americans from the west, the architect of the devil and his radicalized wife made one final desperate stand at their estate. Even as the sound of artillery grew louder, Victoria Adelaide maintained the delusion. She insisted on formal dinners. She demanded the servants' salute. She acted as if the Third Reich was a 1,000-year empire, even as it was measured in days. She had spent decades molding her husband for this specific glory, and she refused to let the reality of defeat spoil her work. When the 1,000-year Reich finally burned to ash in 1945, the psychological spell that had sustained Charles Edward did not just break, it shattered into 1,000,000 jagged pieces of guilt and fear. The transition from the grand stages of the Third Reich to the cold, damp cells of an internment camp was where the mental rot finally turned physical. As the Allied interrogators stripped away his lies, his body began to reveal the first weeping sores of the cancer that would eventually claim his face. It was as if the skin could no longer hold the weight of the atrocities he had authorized. The devil's architect was now a prisoner, and the body that had stood proudly in a Nazi uniform was beginning to manifest the first horrifying signs of the karma that would eventually turn him into a living ghost. When the American troops finally arrived in Coburg in April 1945, they found a man who looked decades older than his years. Charles Edward was arrested as a Class I offender. He was thrown into an internment camp, stripped of his fine uniforms, and forced to face the evidence of the Holocaust, the very crimes his Red Cross had helped mask. But even as he sat in a cold cell, undergoing interrogation, his first thoughts were of Victoria Adelaide's approval. He looked for her in the crowds, hoping she would see his stoicism and be proud. The war was over, but the karma was just beginning. The fall of the Nazi regime didn't just end Charles Edward's career, it broke the psychological spell that had sustained him. Without the rallies, the uniforms, and the constant pumping of ideology from his wife, he was left with nothing but his memories and the mounting pain in his face. The body horror was about to take center stage as the rot that had started in his soul finally inevitably broke through the skin. The silence that fell over Germany in 1945 was more terrifying than the bombs. For Charles Edward, that silence was filled with the realization that the world his wife had built for him was not just a ruin, but a crime scene. When the American Third Army arrived in Coburg, they didn't see a royal duke or a prestigious general. They saw a high-ranking Nazi collaborator. He was promptly arrested and thrown into an internment camp, treated with the same cold indifference he had once shown to the victims of the T4 program. Victoria Adelaide, however, did not break. While her husband sat in a cramped cell, she remained at their estate, Greinberg Castle, attempting to maintain the dignity of a fallen queen. She viewed the American occupation as a temporary inconvenience, a test of character. She sent letters to her husband in prison, not filled with comfort, but with instructions. She told him to remain hard, to remember his German honor, and to never apologize. She was still radicalizing him from a distance, terrified that in the solitude of a prison cell, his English conscience might finally wake up and repent. The denazification trials were a brutal awakening for Charles Edward. He was classified as a Hauptschuldiger, a Category 1 major offender. The evidence presented against him was staggering. His early funding of Hitler, his leadership of the Red Cross during the euthanasia programs, and his role in coordinating the German aristocracy for the Führer. In court, he looked like a man in a trance. He often looked toward the gallery, searching for Victoria Adelaide's face, seeking the cues she had given him for decades. When he spoke, his voice was thin and reed-like, a shadow of the man who had once barked orders at Nazi rallies. It was during these grueling interrogations that the body horror truly began to emerge. The small lesions on his face, which had been ignored during the adrenaline of the war, began to weep and spread. The stress of the trials, combined with the lack of proper medical care in the internment camps, caused his skin to react with violent inflammation. He developed a persistent, scaly patch near his right eye, a basal cell carcinoma that was turning malignant. To his captors, it looked like a standard skin irritation. To Charles Edward, it felt like his face was being slowly consumed by fire. The irony of his situation was absolute. The man who had presided over a medical system that murdered the unfit was now becoming physically unfit himself. He was losing his sight in one eye as the tumor grew, pressing against the orbital bone. He requested specialized medical attention, but the Allied authorities were preoccupied with millions of starving refugees and the survivors of the camps Charles Edward had helped oversee. He was left to rot in a cell, his body beginning to manifest the corruption of his soul. In 1948, he was eventually released, but he was a broken man. He was fined heavily, his assets were frozen, and he was effectively a pauper. The British royal family, led by King George VI, made it clear that he was never to return to England. He was a man without a country, without a title, and now without a face. He returned to Coburg, not to a palace, but to a small apartment, a former groom's quarters in a stable building. The transition from the grand halls of Vesta Coburg to a damp, cold stable was the ultimate humiliation, one that Victoria Adelaide found particularly difficult to bear. In this cramped, stable apartment, the conspiracy of two entered its final, most grotesque phase. Victoria Adelaide, refusing to accept their poverty, attempted to recreate a royal court in the middle of a stable. She insisted on using the last of their silver tea sets and dressing in tattered silks. But as she sat across from her husband at the dinner table, she was forced to look at the work of her hands. The cancer was no longer a hidden irritation. It was a visible, foul-smelling decay. It had eaten through the skin of his cheek, exposing the bone and the sinus cavity beneath. The psychological atmosphere in that stable was suffocating. Victoria Adelaide had spent 40 years pushing Charles Edward to be a god of the new order, and now she was trapped with a man who was literally falling apart. She became his nurse, but her care was clinical and cold, devoid of the warmth one might expect in a long marriage. She saw his illness not as a tragedy, but as a failure of his will. She believed that if he were truly a superior Germanic man, he could simply will the cancer away. Her radicalization had made her incapable of basic human empathy, even for her own husband. The final descent into the stable apartment was not just a loss of property, it was the final stage of a ritualistic destruction. In that cramped, foul-smelling space, the radicalized wife and the living corpse were locked in a final, grotesque embrace of their own making. The transition from a disgraced public figure to a medical anomaly sitting in the dark was the ultimate fulfillment of Victoria Adelaide's vision. She had wanted a husband who was different from the rest of humanity, and in his rotting, bandaged state, she finally had one. As the cancer tunneled through his skull and the world moved on to a new era, Charles Edward was left to face the final agonizing truth that the woman who had promised him glory had only ever built him a tomb. By 1950, the body horror reached its peak. The tumor had invaded the right eye socket, causing the eyeball to bulge and lose all function. The pain was so intense that Charles Edward would spend hours screaming into a pillow so the neighbors wouldn't hear the Duke in such a state. Finally, a local surgeon was brought in to perform a radical operation in the cramped, ill-equipped apartment. This was the moment of surgical horror, the removal of his right eye and a large portion of his facial structure. When the bandages were first removed, even Victoria Adelaide recoiled. Where once had been the face of a British prince, there was now a jagged, raw crater. He was a living ghost, a man whose very presence was an indictment of the ideology that had led him there. He wore a heavy, thick bandage over half his face for the remainder of his life, appearing in public only in the dead of night to walk the grounds of the stable, a phantom royalty haunting the ruins of his own ambition. The stable existence was a profound symbolic reversal. For the British aristocracy, the stable is a place of service, of animals, of utility. For a prince who had betrayed his bloodline to become a superman, to be forced into the quarters of a groom, was a psychic wound that never closed. Victoria Adelaide, however, refused to acknowledge the squalor. In a display of radicalized delusion that bordered on the psychotic, she maintained a rigid protocol within the three-room apartment. She addressed Charles Edward as Your Highness, even as she changed the blood-soaked bandages on his face. She insisted they eat their meager rations with heavy silver forks that had been smuggled out of the palace before the Americans arrived. The psychological atmosphere was a toxic blend of unrepentant pride and agonizing physical decay. Victoria Adelaide remained the radicalized wife until the very end. She didn't offer her husband the comfort of a shared grief. She offered him the cold steel of a shared resentment. She blamed the British, the Americans, and the weak German people for their current state. She never once allowed the word regret to enter their home. To her, Charles Edward's rotting face was not a sign of moral failure, but a wound of war, a physical sacrifice for a cause she still believed was holy. But for Charles Edward, the silence of the stable allowed the voices he had suppressed for decades to finally speak. With only one eye and a body racked by the gnawing pain of the cancer, he began to have visions, or perhaps hallucinations born of heavy sedation and guilt. He would speak to his father, Prince Leopold, the man he never knew. He would whisper in English, the language Victoria Adelaide had tried to purge from his mind, asking for forgiveness for the English boy who had gotten lost in the German woods. Whenever he drifted into these moments of English sentimentality, Victoria Adelaide would snap him back into the present with a sharp German command. She was terrified of his repentance. If Charles Edward repented, it meant her life's work, the radicalization of a prince, was a failure. She needed him to die a Nazi, even if he had to rot to do it. She would read him news of the new Germany, the budding economic miracle of the 1950s, but she would frame it as a betrayal of Hitler's vision. She kept him trapped in 1933, a prisoner of a dead decade. The body horror by 1952 was no longer just a medical condition. It was a shared domestic reality. The cancer had progressed into the bone of the jaw. Charles Edward could no longer eat solid food. He lived on broths and liquids, which Victoria Adelaide fed him with a silver spoon, her hands steady, her eyes devoid of pity. The skin around the surgical crater where his eye had been was now a patchwork of scarred, translucent tissue and raw, weeping sores. He was a living anatomy lesson in the price of extremist ambition. There is a chilling account from one of the few visitors they allowed, a former servant who brought them eggs and milk. The servant described a room where the shadows seemed to move, where the Duke sat in total darkness because the light hurt his raw nerves. The smell of the cancer was so strong it required the windows to be open even in the dead of winter, leaving the elderly couple shivering in their threadbare coats. Yet when the servant entered, Victoria Adelaide would stand with a straight back, her chin tilted up, demanding a level of deference that felt absurd in such a wretched setting. By 1953, the stable apartment had become a tomb in all but name. The physical degradation of Charles Edward was no longer a matter of slow decay. It had accelerated into a final catastrophic collapse. The basal cell carcinoma, having already claimed his right eye and much of his cheek, had now tunneled deeper into the cranial structure. The body horror was absolute. His skull was becoming a literal cage of pain as the cancer pressed against the meninges of his brain. Victoria Adelaide, the woman who had driven him to this precipice, now spent her days in a state of grim, silent vigilance. The manipulation in the bedroom had evolved into a manipulation of the sickbed. She controlled his access to morphine, not out of cruelty, but out of a perverse desire to keep his mind clear and German until the end. She was terrified that in a drug-induced haze, he might revert entirely to his English childhood, or worse, confess his sins to a priest. She needed him to hold the line of their shared delusion until his last breath. The medical reality of Charles Edward's face during this period was something few could look upon without trembling. The surgical crater had never truly healed. Because of the couple's poverty and social isolation, the dressings were often changed using improvised materials. The stench of necrotic flesh was so pervasive that even the rats in the stable walls seemed to keep their distance. He was a man whose body was rotting from the head down, a physical manifestation of a life lived in service to a poisonous ideology. He spent his final months sitting upright as lying down caused the fluids from his wounds to choke him. The twist in the story of Charles Edward is that he did not die a quick or merciful death. He was forced to endure the full, unmitigated weight of his physical karma. In the winter of 1953, a final medical crisis occurred. The cancer eroded a major blood vessel near his jaw. He didn't die from the hemorrhage, but the resulting infection turned his entire face into a mass of inflamed, weeping tissue. His one remaining eye was often swollen shut, leaving him in a world of total darkness and searing agony. In these moments of sensory deprivation, the psychological barriers Victoria Adelaide had built began to crumble. He began to scream, but not in German. He screamed in the English of his youth, calling out for his mother, calling out for the green fields of Surrey. He was no longer the Duke of Saxe-Coburg. He was a terrified English boy, trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Victoria Adelaide would sit by his side, her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of cold fury. She viewed his regression as a final betrayal. To her, his pain was secondary to the weakness of his spirit. One night, in a rare moment of lucidity, Charles Edward reportedly reached out and gripped his wife's hand. He asked her, in a voice that was barely a rasp through his ruined throat, if it had been worth it. He asked if the uniforms, the rallies, and the glory of the Third Reich were worth the stable, the poverty, and the hole in his face. Victoria Adelaide did not answer with comfort. She supposedly pulled her hand away and reminded him that they were Germans of the old sort, and that sacrifice was the only currency that mattered. She remained his jailer even as he stood at the gates of death. The body horror reached its zenith when the cancer finally broke through the roof of his mouth. He could no longer speak, only make a guttural, wet sound that haunted the stable night after night. He was a Xak song in the most literal sense, A man whose vital organs continued to function while his face and skull were being systematically erased. This was the devil's architecture completed. A man built up by royal blood and Nazi power, now hollowed out until only the suffering remained. By the beginning of 1954, Charles Edward weighed less than 90 pounds. He was a skeletal figure, his head a mass of bandages and raw nerves. The world outside was celebrating the coronation of his cousin, Queen Elizabeth II, a symbol of the very British continuity he had tried to destroy. While the bells of London rang for a new Elizabethan age, the traitor prince lay in a stable in Coburg, his one eye staring at a damp ceiling, his breath a ragged, bloody rattle. On March 6, 1954, the ragged, wet breathing in the stable apartment finally ceased. Charles Edward died at the age of 69. There were no fanfares, no state funerals, and no telegrams of condolence from Buckingham Palace. In the end, he did not die as a general or a duke. He died as a medical casualty of his own choices, a skeletal figure whose face had been almost entirely consumed by the karma of his malignancy. When the undertakers arrived at the stable, they were confronted with a sight that even years of post-war hardship had not prepared them for. The living corpse was finally still, but the devastation of the cancer had left his remains almost unrecognizable as human. The body horror had completed its work. He was buried in a quiet, private ceremony at the forest cemetery of Schloss Kallenberg. Only a handful of people attended, and the world at large barely blinked. The devil's architect had been demolished by the very forces he helped unleash, leaving behind nothing but a scarred patch of earth and a name that served as a cautionary whisper in the halls of European royalty. But for Victoria Adelaide, the story did not end with the burial. She lived for another 16 years, a ghost of the Third Reich wandering the modern world. She remained in Coburg, witnessing the economic miracle of West Germany, a democratic, prosperous society that stood as a total refutation of everything she and her husband had fought for. She was forced to live in a world that had not only defeated her ideology, but had found it irrelevant. Her final years were perhaps the most chilling aspect of the radicalized wife narrative. She never repented. She never looked back at the stable, the poverty, or her husband's rotting face and felt the weight of her manipulation. Instead, she spent her time organizing charity for former Nazis and maintaining connections with the remnants of the far right. She viewed herself as a martyr of a lost cause, a queen in exile from a kingdom of hate. She had watched her work, the husband she had molded and radicalized, collapse into a heap of bandaged flesh and bone, and her only reaction was a cold, enduring resentment that the world had not been strong enough to sustain their vision. The marriage of Charles Edward and Victoria Adelaide stands as a dark masterpiece of psychological and ideological destruction. It serves as a terrifying case study in how the intimacy of a relationship can be weaponized. Victoria Adelaide didn't just support her husband, she architected his soul. She took a man who was inherently timid, a man who belonged to the peaceful traditions of his British ancestors, and she pumped him full of a venom that eventually manifested as a physical rot. The devil's architect was not born in a vacuum. He was made in a bedroom. He was radicalized through the whispers of a woman who prioritized power over humanity and who viewed her husband's conscience as an obstacle to be overcome. The body horror that Charles Edward endured, the loss of his eye, the erosion of his face, the squalor of the horse stall, was the materialization of a moral bankruptcy that began the moment he allowed his wife to dictate his sense of honor. Today, as we look back at the ruins of the House of Saxe-Coburg in Gotha, We are reminded that the most dangerous radicalization often happens in silence, behind closed doors, among those we trust the most. It is a reminder that the price of complicity is never just political. It is personal, visceral, and permanent. Charles Edward paid for his wife's ambition with his titles, his country, his eyesight, and his very skin. He died a living ghost, a man who had traded his royal birthright for a Nazi uniform, only to find that the uniform was a shroud. As we conclude this dark journey, we must recognize that the architecture of the devil is still being built today whenever extremist ideology is allowed to fester within the bonds of love and marriage. The story of the traitor prince and his radicalized wife is a warning, echoing from a stable in Coburg.